Evening. This is Friday, December 12th, 38 days until the inauguration of President-elect Barack Obama. And 56 years next month since Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent General Motors President Charles Wilson to the Senate for confirmation as Defense Secretary. A senator asked Wilson whether he could make decisions that might be adverse to GM. Wilson replied, "I cannot conceive of one because for years I thought that what was good for our country was good for General Motors." Our fifth story tonight, the end of an era, as we learn that Senate Republicans are now willing to kill GM, regardless of whether it's good for our country, in order to kill the union of GM's workers. The White House today announced that it will take steps to prevent both GM and Chrysler from failing, possibly dipping into the financial sector bailout funds, the available batch having left approximately $15 billion, almost exactly the amount that was in the bill that fell short in the Senate last night, despite backing from the House and the White House and a majority of the Senate. So what were the sticking points for the Republican minority? Republicans insisted that the United Auto Workers take a pay cut next year, even though the union had already made concessions on health care for workers, health care for retirees, supplemental income for laid-off workers, and even its wages. In talks last night, the union even agreed to Republican demands that their pay equal the pay at non-union foreign-owned plants. Republicans wanted the union pay cuts next year. The union said either all stakeholders, management, creditors, investors, would have to come to the table for across-the-board renegotiations, or the pay cuts would have to wait until 2011 when the current contract expires. Republican insistence on that two-year difference in pay, which makes up only 10% of every car's cost, by itself is not sufficient to establish that Republicans put politics ahead of country here in order to kill or cripple the union. But today, the union chief revealed some of what happened in last night's talks with Republican Senator Bob Corker after the union agreed to some of those concessions.
As Senator Corker recognized, these agreed-to changes would have made an enormous difference in the balance sheets of the companies and largely solved their financial problems. Senator Corker admitted to our people on the ground there that the other discussions over wages were largely about politics within the GOP caucus.
Some Republicans, however, claim the union killed the bailout. Senator John Ensign, quote, "The UAW walked away from a very reasonable deal." Senator Jim DeMint, quote, "It sounds like the UAW blew up the deal." It may sound as though Ensign and DeMint really wanted a deal if only it weren't for the gosh darn UAW, but there's no way to assess who really wanted to block the bailout of America's auto industry, unless you were to read this memo obtained by Countdown, which Senate Republicans circulated internally on Wednesday morning, well before the House had even passed its version of the bill. Quote, Senators Ensign, Shelby, Coburn, and DeMint, the message they want us to deliver is, this is the Democrats' first opportunity to pay off organized labor after the election. Republicans should stand firm and take their first shot against organized labor. If we can hold the Republicans, we can beat this. Today, GM announced it will temporarily shut down most of its North American plants for much of the first quarter of 2009. Right now, we're joined by MSNBC political analyst Jonathan Alter, also senior editor at Newsweek magazine and author of The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. Jonathan, good evening.
Good to see you, David.
We're going to get to the union busting first, but what happens now? What are the White House options that it is considering this weekend?
Well, those options are narrowing, but it's basically to kick the can down the road. Congress approved half of the $700 billion in what are called TARP money for the financial industry, 350 of it at a time. They've spent $335 billion so far. That leaves, by sheer luck, $15 billion that can be spent, and that is precisely the number that the auto industry needs to at least get into the beginning of next spring without going out of business.
Let's suppose the Bush administration does dip into the TARP or the Treasury Department finds the funds in Cheney's vault. What are the restrictions or the strings that the Bush administration can attach to that money?
Well, it's interesting. You know, the strings for Wall Street were very, very few. You've got these guys at the Treasury Department who can basically shovel out the money to Wall Street. I think because those strings are very few, I'm not sure they'll be able to just willy-nilly attach strings under the legislation of a couple of months ago. So it may be, ironically, for Senate Republicans that there are fewer strings attached to the $15 billion that comes from TARP than there would have been in the bill on the Hill.
Ironically, it was Vice President Cheney who warned Republicans if they did not pass this auto bailout bill, it's Herbert Hoover time. Is he right? Did he just write his own legacy?
Well, you know, that would be maybe a little bit premature. But the point is that if the auto industry went into bankruptcy, there would be literally millions of people thrown out of work. So what Cheney was talking about was that when that happened under Herbert Hoover, it absolutely destroyed the Republican Party for more than a generation, because that was on their head. And what Cheney was saying to these recalcitrant Republicans was, look, if we win on this, this is on our watch, not just my and Bush's watch, but the Republicans' watch, that they will be seen as the ones who threw millions of people out of work. It will take us another generation to live it down as it did Herbert Hoover. But it turned out that there were enough Republicans who weren't listening, because the president and the vice president are no longer running their party.
What do you make of this memo that we got a copy of? It's called Action Alert, simply for Senate Republicans to essentially get the union. What do you make of it?
I just thought it was fascinating that you came up with this, because rather than, you know, taking a kind of a statesman-like approach, which is that it's wrong for taxpayers to bail out irresponsible management, something like that would at least be principled. This was a partisan sledgehammer at organized labor. And even if you think that labor needs to make more concessions, this was a real insight into the kind of nasty core of the Republican argument. I don't think it's worthy of some of those more principled conservatives who are taking a more legitimate kind of free market attitude toward this. This had a nastiness to it that was fascinating.
And some of these senators, of course, represent southern states which are a long-time anti-union, which also don't have the same sort of protections for the foreign company auto workers in their states, and yet, of course, that wasn't an issue that the senators wanted to bring up. In any case, Jonathan Alter, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks, David.